Tuesday night, October. The corner office on the 54th floor of a glass tower in Hudson Yards, New York. Ryan set the check on the desk without even looking at his wife's face. $1 million. Sign the NDA. Disappear quietly. Ellie looked at the check, looked at the man she thought she knew better than anyone for 7 years. Then she raised her eyes calm in a way that was almost frightening. Keep it, Ryan. No trembling. No tears. You're going to need every single penny. Ryan let out a short laugh. What exactly are you going to do? You have no one. You have nothing. Apex Ventures. Ellie cut him off, the corner of her mouth curling just slightly. Your biggest institutional investor. Have you ever once asked yourself who is actually controlling them? For the first time in 7 years, the woman her husband had called deadweight smiled. And that was the moment Ryan Ashford's empire began to fall. This is the story of a woman who was underestimated and the price the wrong person had to pay. Follow now so you don't miss what happens next. On a Tuesday night in October, I stood in my husband's office doorway holding a small shopping bag from Nordstrom. Inside that bag was a pair of tiny ivory knit baby booties, wrapped in white tissue paper, with a handwritten note card tucked underneath that said, "Coming May 14th. I was 8 weeks pregnant. I had known for 6 days. I had spent those 6 days imagining the exact expression on Ryan's face when he read that card. I had rehearsed the moment approximately 40 times in the shower, on the subway, at my desk at work when I was supposed to be reviewing grant applications. I had made a reservation at the Italian restaurant in the West Village, where we had our first real date. The one that had somehow survived 20 years of Manhattan real estate pressure and still had the same red leather booths and the same basket of bread that arrived without asking. I had been planning this reveal for 2 weeks. Instead, I discovered he had been sleeping with his VP of communications for 4 months. And 36 hours after that discovery, he handed me a check for $1 million and told me to disappear quietly. He was so certain I had nowhere to go. He was so certain. Because in 7 years of marriage, I had never once told him my last name was not really Ashford. It was Hartwell. And my father, my quiet, orchid-tending, cable-knit sweater-wearing father in Greenwich, Connecticut, owned the company that owned Ryan's company. This is the story of how I lost everything in one night, and how I got so much more back than I ever expected to. My name is Eleanor Hartwell Ashford. Most people call me Ellie. I grew up in Greenwich, Connecticut, in a house with a name, not a number, a name, Hartwell Farm. It sat at the end of a long driveway lined with oak trees that had been there longer than the state of Connecticut had been a state, or at least that was what my grandfather used to say, and no one ever bothered to correct him. I watched money shape everything around me from the time I was small. I watched it change my father's friendships. I watched it follow every relationship it touched like a shadow that was never quite the right shape. My father, Charles Hartwell, was a private equity titan who had spent 40 years building something he called the Quiet Vehicle, a network of funds and institutional investments that operated well outside the range of public attention. He did not appear on magazine covers. He did not give keynote speeches at conferences. He built things carefully, in the background, and he controlled them with a precision that I found, as a child, both impressive and frightening. When I left for college at NU, I made a decision. I would be Eleanor Harrison, my mother's maiden name. I would earn my own salary. I would pay my own rent. I would fall in love the ordinary way, without the Hartwell name preceding me into every room, without the weight of the estate and the trust fund and the connections sitting between me and every person I tried to get close to. And when I found the right person, I would know, without any doubt, that they wanted me. Not the name, not the money, just me. I met Ryan Ashford in the spring of my junior year, at a crowded coffee shop near campus where he was sitting at the only available table with a second-hand laptop and 3 empty espresso cups and the specific, focused energy of someone who believed completely in what they were building. He was 27 to my 23. He was brilliant and funny and so genuinely hungry in a way that had nothing to do with arrogance. He talked about his startup idea for 45 minutes without stopping. And somewhere around the 30-minute mark, I stopped listening to the words and started watching his face. And I thought, this is what it looks like when someone is completely alive. I paid his portion of the electric bill twice without mentioning it. I stayed up until 2 in the morning proofreading his investor pitch decks. I drove him to meetings when the subway was down and his nerves were shot. When his first 2 startups failed, I sat on the floor of our small Astoria apartment and listened to him talk through what had gone wrong without offering solutions he had not asked for. Because I had learned early that what Ryan needed in failure was not an answer but a witness. I never lied to him about who I was. I want to be clear about that. I simply never told him the whole truth. And for a long time, I convinced myself those were the same thing. 7 years later, Ryan Ashford was the 34-year-old CEO of Vertex Analytics, a data company that had just crossed a $2.2 billion valuation. He had been profiled in Fast Company. A framed copy of the article hung in the hallway of our $9 million pre-war penthouse on the Upper West Side, hung by Ryan himself without asking whether I wanted it there. The distance between us had accumulated in small, specific ways that were worse than any single argument. He checked his phone during dinner and did not look up for 11 minutes. I counted. At a company event, a rooftop dinner at a hotel in Midtown, Ryan introduced his VP of Communications, Brooke Vanderbilt, to a table of investors as the most strategically important hire he had ever made. I was standing 2 feet to his left. No one looked at me. He corrected my pronunciation of a wine at a client dinner, and I let it pass. And he did it again 2 weeks later with a different wine, and I let that pass too. When I was offered a board seat at a major arts foundation, genuinely prestigious work I had been building toward for 3 years, I told Ryan over dinner on a Wednesday evening. He said, "That is sweet, babe," and changed the subject to his Series C funding round before I had finished my sentence. There is a specific kind of loneliness that lives inside a marriage that is ending. It does not feel like fighting. It does not feel like distance exactly. It feels like being translated into a language the other person has stopped bothering to learn. I told myself it was the pressure of the company, that he would come back once the funding closed, that the man I had stayed up editing pitch decks for at 2 in the morning was still in there somewhere, just buried. I told myself a lot of things that were not true. On the night of our 7th anniversary, in October, Ryan walked through the door of our penthouse at 7:14 in the evening and did not take off his coat. "Ellie," he said, not looking up from his phone, "cancel the reservation. The Apex term sheets are closing next week, and Grant Porter is getting cold feet about the board restructuring. I need to get back to the office." I said, "Ryan, it is our anniversary." He said, "I know what day it is. I also know that Apex represents $450 million, and if I lose Porter's confidence this week, that number walks out the door. Send the restaurant our apologies. Order in." He picked up his keys. He moved toward the door. I said, quietly, "When did we stop being worth a Tuesday night?" He stopped. He did not turn around. He said, "When the stakes got high enough that Tuesday nights became a luxury. You knew what this company required when you married me." The door closed. I stood in the kitchen for a long moment, holding the Nordstrom bag with the tiny booties inside. Then I picked up my keys, walked down to the street, and got in a cab to his office. I was going to look him in the eye and tell him we were having a baby. I believed, completely and genuinely, that those words would snap him out of whatever altitude sickness the company had given him, that the news would bring him back. I was wrong about almost everything that happened next, but I was right about one thing. That cab ride changed the rest of my life. The executive floor of Vertex Analytics occupied the 54th story of a glass tower in Hudson Yards. After hours on a Tuesday, the wing was dark except for the warm glow of a single corner office at the end of the hall. I used my spousal access card at the security gate. The receptionist's desk was empty. My footsteps were quiet on the thick carpet. I could see light under Ryan's office door from 30 feet away. I heard Brooke Vanderbilt's voice before I reached it. Low, practiced laughter, the specific kind designed to be heard. I pushed the door open. Ryan was leaning against his desk with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled up. Brooke was standing close to him, her hand resting along his jaw. His hand was resting on her waist. He was looking at her the way he used to look at me in our small Astoria apartment, before the company, before the penthouse, before everything, with something that looked unmistakably like tenderness. I stepped fully into the room. Ryan's face moved through panic, then guilt, then a kind of defensive composure I recognized from difficult board meetings. I said to Brooke, "Would you give us the room, please?" It was not a question. Brooke took her phone from the desk and left without speaking. I closed the door. I sat down in the chair across from Ryan's desk, the one clients use. I set my bag in my lap. I said, "How long?" He said, "Ellie." I said, "How long, Ryan?" He exhaled. He said, 4 months. I said, "Are you in love with her?" Silence, which was its own answer. He moved into the composure of a man who had been rehearsing something. He said, "I think we need to be honest with each other. This marriage has been over for a long time. We both know that. You want one kind of life, and I am building something that requires a completely different kind of partner. Brooke understands this world. She understands what it takes. You are a good person, Ellie, but you do not want this. You never really did." I said, "You are going to tell me I do not want this." After 7 years, he said, "My attorneys will contact you tomorrow. We have the prenuptial agreement. This can be clean, because I am not a cruel person. I will write you a check for $1 million in exchange for a non-disclosure agreement." No press, no social media. No calls to page 6. You take the money and you start over. It is more than fair. 5 seconds of complete silence. I said, "You want to pay me $1 million to disappear?" He said, "I want to handle this like adults." I stood up. I picked up my bag. I kept my voice completely level. I said, "Keep your million, Ryan. You are going to need every single penny of it," he said, almost scoffing. "And where exactly are you planning to go? You make $48,000 a year at a nonprofit. You do not have anywhere to disappear to." I said, "Good night." I walked out. I did not look back. My heels clicked evenly down the empty hallway and into the elevator, and I rode down 54 floors in complete silence. I walked out of the building into the October rain. I did not tell him about the pregnancy. Not as a strategy. Not because I was calculating what to do with it later. I did not tell him because in that chair, looking at his face, I understood something I had not understood before. He had forfeited the right to know. The child I was carrying was mine. He had made his choices. I would make mine. The following morning, I was on Sarah Connors's couch at 8:15, still wearing the same clothes from the night before. Sarah was an event planner who lived in the West Village and had been my closest friend since the first week of college. She was sitting across from me in an NYU sweatshirt with a coffee mug in both hands, listening. She did not interrupt once while I talked. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Okay, before you do anything, and I mean anything, including texting your mother or posting anything anywhere, you need an attorney, not next week." "To this morning," I said. "Sarah," she said. "My cousin Caroline went through something like this 3 years ago. First thing she did was send a furious voice message to her mother-in-law, which got screenshotted and submitted as evidence of emotional instability by his legal team. It cost her $14,000 in fees and 2 months of proceedings just to bury it. You do not send one text. You do not post one word. You do not call Brooke Vanderbilt. You say absolutely nothing publicly until an attorney tells you what you are working with." She leaned forward. She said, "Your silence in the next 48 hours is not weakness. It is the most powerful thing you have right now. I want to speak directly to anyone listening who recognizes this situation, from either side of it." Sarah was right. The impulse to react immediately, to be seen reacting, is completely natural, and it can cost you everything. The most protective thing you can do in the first 48 hours of a betrayal is be very, very quiet. Document everything you have legal access to: texts, emails, financial statements, any shared account records you can reach. Write down every conversation you remember with dates and as much detail as you can. Then stop. Get legal counsel before you move in any direction. The storm will come regardless. Make sure you are standing on solid ground when it does. I told Sarah one more thing before I asked her to help me find an attorney. I told her I was pregnant. 8 weeks. She set her mug down very carefully on the coffee table. Then she moved to the couch and put her arm around me and did not say anything for a while, because some moments do not need words. That was the moment I actually cried. Not in the cab from his office. Not in the elevator. Not standing in the rain on the street outside the building. In Sarah Connors's living room at 8 in the morning, with bad coffee and her arm around my shoulders. That was when it hit me. I was going to do this alone, or so I thought. Margaret Cole was a family law partner at a firm in Midtown who came to me by way of Sarah's recommendation and 3 5-star reviews from women who had been through situations similar enough to mine that reading the testimonials felt uncomfortably familiar. She was in her early 50s, direct without being cold, and she spoke to me in her conference room that Tuesday afternoon the way a competent doctor delivers a difficult diagnosis, clearly, completely, and without softening the parts that needed to be heard plainly. She reviewed what I knew about the prenuptial agreement. She asked precise questions about assets accumulated during the marriage. She pulled up the public filings for Vertex Analytics on her laptop and scrolled through them with the focused attention of someone who reads these documents the way other people read menus. After 40 minutes, she closed the laptop. She said, "Ryan made an assumption when he offered you that check. He assumed the prenup was the whole picture. It is not. Several significant assets accumulated during your marriage were not properly categorized in the agreement. He may have substantially less leverage than he believes." She paused. She said, "He assumed you would take the money and disappear. That assumption may be the most expensive mistake he has made." I walked out of Margaret's office onto 48th Street and took a full breath of cold October air. I had a plan. I had an attorney. I was going to be all right. The relief was real and physical. My shoulders dropped. My jaw unclenched. For the first time since the night before, I felt something solid under my feet. I gave myself 45 seconds of that feeling. Then my phone rang. It was Margaret, calling back. Her voice was different. she said. Ellie, Ryan filed this morning. That is not unexpected. But his filing includes an additional petition I need you to know about immediately. There is a custody petition. I said, custody? We do not have. She said he knows about the pregnancy. He has photographs of you entering your OBGYN's office in the West Village, dated last Thursday. A private investigator. His team is claiming the PI was originally hired because Ryan suspected you were concealing assets throughout the marriage. She paused again, and I could hear her choosing her next words carefully. She said, the custody petition goes further than that, Ellie. His attorney is arguing that you have demonstrated a pattern of deliberate financial deception and that he has concerns about your fitness as a primary parent. This is a pressure tactic. I want to be clear about that. But I also need you to understand. He is attempting to use your pregnancy as a weapon. I was standing on 48th Street. People moved around me on the sidewalk. A cab honked. Someone bumped my shoulder without apologizing, I said, very quietly. He had me photographed at my doctor's office. She said, come back up. We need to talk through the next steps carefully. And there it was. The thing I had protected most carefully, the one fact I kept entirely for myself, had already been discovered, documented, and converted into legal ammunition. Before I had told a single person outside of Sarah, before I had processed it myself, I stood on the sidewalk on 48th Street and I felt, for the first time since all of this began, truly and completely helpless, not hurt, not angry, helpless. That was low point number one. I want to be honest about what that word means when you are inside it. Helpless does not feel the way it looks from the outside. It does not feel like weakness or collapse. It feels like the floor has been removed from beneath you while everything around you continues moving at normal speed. People walking, cabs honking, the city doing what the city does, entirely indifferent to the fact that you are standing still in the middle of it because you cannot quite figure out where to put your next step. I went back up to Margaret's office. I sat in the same chair I had sat in an hour before, when I was still someone who believed she had a plan. I said, what do we do? Margaret said, we do not panic. We document. We respond methodically, and we wait for whatever move he makes next. Because people who operate the way Ryan is operating right now tend to keep moving. They tend to overreach, and overreach creates openings. I held on to that. I did not know yet how right she was. That evening, sitting in Sarah's guest room with the lights off and the city noise coming through the window, I thought about my father for the first time in a way that was not abstract. Charles Hartwell, 67 years old, Greenwich, Connecticut, a man I had spent the better part of a decade keeping at arm's length, because I was afraid of what came with his name. I thought about the birthday card on the credenza, the Greenwich return address on thick cream linen stock, the way I used to slide his letters under stacks of books before Ryan came back into the room. I thought about the conversation I had been avoiding for 3 years. Then I picked up my phone, and I called my father. The phone rang twice before he answered. He said, Eleanor. I said, Dad, he knows about the baby. He is using it legally, and I just needed to hear your voice. Long pause. He said, come home tonight, right now. Do not go back to the apartment. The Hartwell estate in Greenwich sat at the end of a long driveway bordered by oak trees older than the house itself. It was a large New England home, white clapboard with dark green shutters, and a wraparound porch with furniture that had been there for 30 years and clearly used. There was a yellow Labrador named Fletcher who slept by the kitchen door. The house smelled of coffee and wood smoke. My father opened the front door in a flannel shirt and wool slacks before my car had fully stopped, and he opened his arms. And I walked into them. He held on for a long time. He did not say anything. He did not need to. Eventually, I stepped back. He read my face the way parents who have been absent too long learn to read their children in moments of crisis. All at once, with very close attention, he said, come inside. Tell me everything. I sat at the kitchen table under the warm light, and I told him everything, Ryan. Brooke. The custody petition, the PI photographs, the check for $1 million, the NDA. Fletcher put his head on my foot under the table. When I finished, I told him about the pregnancy. Something crossed my father's face that was not quite any single emotion, but was clearly profound. He said, you are not alone, Eleanor. Whatever happens next, you are not alone in this. He picked up his coffee cup, set it down. He said, the PI who photographed you at the doctor's office. Margaret got his name. I said, yes, he said. Because I recognized it when you said it. And there is something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you 18 months ago. I need you to not react until I am finished. I said, tell me, he said. 2 years ago, I started noticing changes in Ryan. Not dramatic ones. Small things. The way he talked about money. The way he talked about you at family dinners when he did not think I was paying attention. I became concerned, so I hired an investigator to watch the marriage. I went very still. I said, "You had our marriage watched." He said, "I had the situation monitored." I understand that distinction may not feel meaningful to you right now. I said, "What did you find?" He said, "I found that Ryan had been moving closer to Brooke Vanderbilt for approximately 2 years. I found that he had begun restructuring certain marital assets in ways that would disadvantage you in a separation. And I found that he had hired the same investigator, the one his team used to photograph you at the doctor's office, to look into your financial background. Ryan suspected for some time that you were not who you said you were. He never found anything definitive, but he was looking." I said, "You knew all of this for 18 months, and you said nothing." "Silence," he said. "I was afraid of what would happen if I called. You had pulled away from the family. You had made it very clear that you needed distance from the Hartwell name and everything that came with it. I was afraid you would see it as interference, that I would lose you completely. I made a calculation. It was the wrong one. I am sorry. I want to stop here and say something directly, because this moment in my story is where I get the most messages from people who have been through something similar. My father was not the villain of this story, but he made a choice that felt protective and was actually controlling, even though it did not look like control from where he was standing. The line between protecting someone and deciding for them what information they are allowed to have is thinner than most people realize. If you are in a relationship, any relationship, where someone who loves you is managing what you know about your own life because they are afraid of how you will react, that is worth examining. Being loved does not mean being managed. Those are different things. I said, "Tell me about Apex Ventures." He said, "Why?" I said, "Because I have read every funding document Ryan has filed since the Series A. I know Apex is his lead institutional investor. And I remember, when I was 16, you used to talk about a fund you had been building for 30 years that you called the Quiet Vehicle. You never told me its name, but I remember how you described it." I looked at him. I said, "Dad, is Hartwell Capital invested in Apex Ventures?" He was quiet for a long time, long enough that the answer was obvious before he said it. He said, "Hartwell Capital holds a controlling stake in Apex's primary growth fund." "Yes," I said. "Walk me through exactly how that works. I want to understand every step." He said, "Hartwell Capital is the parent. We do not invest directly into companies like Vertex. That is not how old money operates. Instead, we fund institutional vehicles. Apex Ventures is one of them. We hold a controlling position in Apex's primary growth fund, meaning we control the majority of the capital that Apex deploys into its portfolio companies. Apex is Ryan's lead institutional investor. They provided the backbone of his Series A, his Series B, and they were weeks away from closing his Series C. Every major funding round Vertex has ever had traces back through Apex, and Apex traces back to us. Ryan does not own his company outright. He owns his equity stake. But the debt structure, the credit lines, the covenant agreements, all of it runs through Apex. And Apex answers to Hartwell Capital. He looked at me, he said. He built his empire on a foundation he never bothered to look underneath. The kitchen was entirely still, I said, quietly. He called me dead weight. Dad, he said I had no ambition, no pedigree, that I was holding him back from the life he deserved. He was sitting on top of my family's money the entire time and he had no idea. My father said, "None whatsoever." He stood. He moved toward the phone on the sideboard. I said, "Stop." He stopped. I said, "Do not touch that phone. Do not call anyone. Do not move $1. Do not activate one covenant. Do not do one single thing until I tell you I am ready. Do you understand me? This is my marriage, my child, my decision. If we act when I say." And the way I say, my father, who had run a private equity empire for 40 years, looked at his daughter for a long moment. He said, "Yes, I understand." He sat back down. He did not reach for the phone. For the first time since this had all begun, I felt something that was not quite power and not quite peace, but was something in between, something steady, something that was mine. I spent 4 days at the estate. I talked to Margaret daily. I talked to Sarah twice a day. I began to understand the full shape of what Ryan had built and, more importantly, the full shape of what he had built it on. A plan was forming, not rushed, not reactive, methodical. I was choosing each step deliberately for the first time in longer than I could remember. On the 5th morning, I video called Sarah from the estate library. Late morning, pale Connecticut light through the tall windows. She said, "You look like yourself again." "I mean that," I said. "I think I might actually sleep tonight for the first time this week." She said, "Okay, good. That is good. I need to tell you something before you see it somewhere online." The relief in the room evaporated. I said, "What?" She held her phone up to the camera. The headline was visible on her screen. Vertex CEO Ryan Ashford on the company's next chapter in a mutual personal transition. Beneath the headline, a photograph taken 2 nights earlier at a charity gala. Ryan in a navy suit. Brooke Vanderbilt in a red dress, his hand on the small of her back. Both of them looking directly at the camera with the comfortable ease of people who had been practicing this for months. And at the bottom of the article, almost a throwaway detail planted with surgical precision by Ryan's communications team. Sources close to the couple confirm that Mrs. Ashford is expecting a complication in what had been hoped to be a clean and amicable separation. I said he leaked the pregnancy. To the Journal, Sarah said. It went everywhere. Ellie. Instagram. Twitter. It is trending. People are saying, I said I know what they are saying. I want to tell you what it is like to have the most private fact of your life made public without your consent in a national newspaper, framed by someone who was supposed to love you as evidence of your own manipulation. The internet moved with the speed and confidence of a body that does not require evidence. Within 4 hours, I was trending under a hashtag. The comments were what you would expect. Gold digger, baby trap. She knew what she was doing. He should have known better than to marry someone with no ambition, no pedigree. That last phrase, I recognized the source. He had not just leaked my pregnancy. He had given them the script. The impulse in that moment is to respond, to correct the record, to make yourself visible in your own story and shout from the loudest available platform that you are not what they are saying you are. I understand that impulse completely, and I am telling you, as someone who lived through it, do not. Not because the truth does not matter, but because anything you say publicly, while the narrative is still being written by someone else, becomes their ammunition. Wait. Document. Let them keep moving. Overreach creates openings. Margaret had told me that 5 days earlier, and I held on to it like a handhold on a very steep surface. I did not post. I did not call. I did not respond to a single message. 2 days later, Margaret called again. She said, Ellie, I need you to stay calm while I explain what has happened. Ryan's legal team reviewed communications during discovery. They identified an exchange between our office and a contact at Hartwell Capital. They are alleging it constitutes evidence of coordinated financial retaliation against Vertex Analytics. She took a breath. She said, they filed an emergency injunction this morning to freeze your father's ability to act against Apex Ventures, and they are naming you personally as a co-defendant in a tortious interference lawsuit. Ellie, the amount they are seeking is $200 million, I said. They are suing me, she said, and your father, for $200 million. But there is more. Ryan's PI submitted a new affidavit to the family court this morning. He is claiming he found evidence that you maintained contact with Hartwell Capital executives throughout the marriage, which his team is framing as proof that you conducted financial activities your husband was deliberately kept unaware of, in violation of your marital agreement. Ellie, he is trying to position you as the one who ran a secret financial operation. He's trying to make you the deceiver in this story. I was in the sunroom at the estate when that call came. Sarah was in the chair across from me. She watched my face as I listened. After the call ended, I sat with the phone in my lap. Sarah did not say anything. She waited. After a long moment, I said, I need to call Dr. Hayes. My therapist, Dr. Patricia Hayes, had a virtual session with me that afternoon. I sat in the sunroom with my phone propped against a cushion and the late afternoon light fading behind me. She said, I want you to hear something clearly, and I want you to let it actually land before you respond. What Ryan is doing right now has a name. It is called DARVO. Deny, attack, reverse victim and offender. He committed adultery. He ended the marriage. He leaked your pregnancy to a national newspaper. And now his legal team is constructing a narrative in which he is the wrong party and you are the one who ran a deception for 7 years. This is a strategy, Ellie. It is not a reflection of reality. And the fact that you can see it clearly, even right now, even in the worst of it, tells me you have not lost yourself in this. That matters enormously. She gave me the word DARVO, and it changed how I understood what was happening. If you are in a relationship or a post-relationship conflict where you feel like no matter what your partner does wrong, you somehow become the one who is blamed for the problem. Look that up. DARVO. Understanding that what is being done to you has a name, that it has been studied, that there is a recognizable architecture to it, that knowledge is protective. It helps you stop absorbing someone else's narrative about your own life. That night, I sat in the dark in the estate library and I thought about Ryan, not with grief and not with anger, with the clear, cold attention of someone who is beginning to understand the full dimensions of what they are dealing with. He was not just a man who had cheated on his pregnant wife. He was a man running out of options, filing motions in every direction, throwing every possible accusation at the wall because he had begun to understand, somewhere underneath the arrogance, that the ground was shifting under his feet. People who are desperate make mistakes. I thought about what Margaret had said. Overreach creates openings. I thought about the $200 million lawsuit and the custody petition and the journal article. He was not winning. He was panicking. And something in me went very quiet and very still. I picked up my phone and called my father. I said, I am ready. A week after the $200 million lawsuit was filed, I was back in the city briefly for meetings with Margaret. I was staying at Sarah's apartment in the West Village. Early evening, the kind of gray October light that makes everything look slightly cinematic without asking permission. Sarah's intercom buzzed from downstairs. Her voice came over it, carefully neutral in a way that immediately told me she was working to keep it that way. She said, Ellie, there is a woman down here. Her name is Brooke Vanderbilt. She says she has documents you need to see and that she has nowhere else to take them. A very long silence. I said, send her up. Brooke Vanderbilt arrived looking nothing like the woman in the journal photograph. The red dress gala confidence was completely gone. She was in jeans and a coat with no jewelry and no makeup. She had a manila envelope under one arm and the specific, recognizable look of someone who had not slept properly in a week. She stopped in the doorway when she saw me and did not pretend the situation was anything other than what it was. She said, I know you do not have any reason to let me sit down. I am going to say what I came to say and then you can decide. I said, say it. She said, 3 months ago, I was preparing a press release about Vertex's performance metrics. I accidentally accessed a set of internal API logs I was not supposed to see. I was pulling a report and the system gave me the wrong permissions. The numbers in those logs did not match the numbers Ryan had been presenting to investors and to the board. I asked him about it. He told me I had misread the data. He was very convincing. I let it go. But I kept a copy of what I found, because something felt wrong and I did not know what to do with that feeling. She looked at me directly. She said, Ellie, I think the algorithm is fraudulent. I think he hard-coded a bypass to falsify the data processing metrics. The user retention numbers he has been showing investors since the Series A are inflated by something in the range of 300 to 400%. Vertex Analytics is not a $2 billion company. It is a house of cards built on fabricated data. Silence, I said. He has been committing securities fraud. She said, yes. And the moment someone sophisticated takes over that company and actually looks at the back-end code, they are going to find it. And then Ryan is going to tell every investigator and every journalist that I knew the whole time. I did not. But I cannot prove I did not without disclosing what I have. And I cannot take what I have to the SEC without an attorney I cannot currently afford. Because Ryan terminated my employment yesterday morning, without severance. His attorney sent a letter simultaneously claiming I had violated my NDA by communicating with adverse parties, which I had not done yet. But I assumed someone told him I was thinking about it. I said, he fired you, she said, yesterday at 9 in the morning. I looked at Brooke Vanderbilt for a long time, not as the woman from the photograph. Not as the person who had been standing between my husband's legs in his office, as a person sitting in front of me with an envelope that could be nothing or could be everything. I said, I will cover your legal fees. She said, why? I said, because what you just handed me is the piece I did not know I was missing. And because the enemy of my enemy, in this very specific situation, is someone I am willing to work with. I held out my hand. After a moment, she put the envelope in it. I want to be transparent about something, because I think it matters. I did not like Brooke Vanderbilt on that evening. I am not certain I have fully liked her since. She made choices that hurt me, and she knew they were hurting me, and she made them anyway. That is true. But here is the other thing that is true. She could have burned those documents. She could have deleted the logs, protected herself, and disappeared quietly. Instead, she came through my best friend's front door with inconvenient evidence and handed it over. That took something, and I was in no position to turn it away. There is a lesson in that. Maybe the most practically useful one in this whole story. The person you most want to blame in a situation of betrayal is rarely the most powerful actor in the room. Ryan made deliberate, sustained choices. Brooke made mistakes. Those are different things. Treating them as different things was hard. It was also correct. The ability to receive help from someone unexpected, someone you have every emotional reason to reject, is one of the hardest things to do when you are in the middle of a crisis. The instinct is to only trust people who are already in your corner. That instinct is understandable. It is also limiting. Sometimes the information you need, comes from exactly the person you least want to receive it from. Being able to separate the source from the substance is a skill. It is worth developing. I called my father that night. I told him about the documents. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Does Bradley Webb know about the algorithmic bypass? I said. Brooke believes he discovered it approximately 6 weeks ago. He said Bradley Webb is a good man in a very bad situation. He will want a way out of it. 2 days later, Margaret arranged a confidential meeting with Bradley Webb, Vertex's CFO. He arrived with his own attorney and a portable hard drive that contained 3 years of internal audit records. He had been sitting on them, he said, because he had not known who to trust. He knew now. Margaret filed a formal SEC referral the following morning, jointly submitted on behalf of Ellie Hartwell Ashford, Brooke Vanderbilt, and Bradley Webb, regarding the algorithmic fraud in Vertex Analytics funding rounds from Series A through Series C. And then I called my father again. I said, now. The conference room on the 40th floor of Apex Ventures occupied a corner of the building with floor-to-ceiling windows looking west over the Hudson River. It had a long walnut table and 8 high-backed leather chairs and the specific quality of silence that expensive rooms have when they are waiting for something to happen. When I walked in that morning, I walked in first. My father came through the door behind me. Margaret was to my left. The Hartwell Capital attorneys were already seated along one side of the table. Grant Porter, the managing partner of Apex Ventures, sat near the middle with his general counsel beside him. He looked at me with an expression that contained, I thought, both respect and something that might have been relief. I set my bag on the table. I sat at the head of it. My father sat to my right. He did not open his mouth. I slid the first set of documents across the table to Grant Porter before anyone else had spoken. I said, Apex Ventures is the lead institutional investor in Vertex Analytics. Hartwell Capital holds a controlling position in Apex's primary growth fund. My father and I have reviewed the debt covenant structure in Ryan Ashford's 2019 funding agreement. We are exercising our contractual right to call in the outstanding debt obligations under that covenant structure. Effective immediately, Grant Porter said. Ellie, this will end him. Grant, you are looking at my father. Look at me. He has spent his whole life being the person in this kind of room. I am the person in this room now, and yes, it will end him. That is the appropriate outcome. Additionally, I said, we are initiating a formal hostile takeover of Vertex Analytics' intellectual property assets to cover the debt default. Bradley Webb has been cooperating with our attorneys for the past 72 hours. He will be a witness in the federal proceedings. I placed a final document in the center of the table. I said the SEC referral was filed this morning by my attorney, jointly with counsel for Brooke Vanderbilt and Bradley Webb. The algorithmic fraud at Vertex Analytics dates to the Series A. The documentation is complete. The room was very quiet. Ryan arrived at Apex Ventures 20 minutes later. He had been told only that there were urgent funding matters requiring his immediate presence. He walked in with his attorney beside him, prepared for a negotiation. He opened the conference room door and walked directly into the fact of me sitting at the head of the table in the room that ran his company. His face did something complicated. Confusion first, then a recognition beginning to form at the edges, then something that might have been the first real fear he had felt in years. He said, Ellie, what is this? What are you doing here? I said, sit down, Ryan. We have a lot of documents to get through, and my father has somewhere to be at 4. He looked from me to my father. He looked at the documents on the table. He looked at Grant Porter's face, which told him everything he needed to know about who was controlling this room. He sat down. His attorney leaned close and spoke quietly. Ryan's expression moved through several things I recognized: denial, calculation, the desperate search for an angle that did not exist. He said, Ellie, listen to me. Please, I made mistakes. The pressure of the company, it changed me. Brooke, the whole situation. I did not understand what I was doing. I am genuinely. I said, you called me dead weight, Ryan, in front of your VP of Communications. In your office, at 9 o'clock at night. You called me dead weight. You said I had no ambition and no pedigree. And then you had someone photograph me at my doctor's office. And then you leaked my pregnancy to the Wall Street Journal to make me look like a predator in the press. I stood. I said, I am not here for an apology. I am here because you built a $2 billion empire on funding that ultimately traces back to my family, while telling me that I was the one holding you back. That deserves to be corrected. Sign the divorce petition. Withdraw the custody claim today, before 5 o'clock, or my attorney will make it the centerpiece of our public response. You will receive no Hartwell money, not $1. Ryan looked at me, at his attorney, at the documents, at the window. He picked up the pen. My father said, quietly, just one word. He said, good. Ryan signed the divorce petition. He signed the custody withdrawal. His attorney gathered the documents without making eye contact with anyone. Ryan stood. He looked at me one last time. I saw in his face Not the man from the boardroom, and not the man from the photograph with Brooke at the charity gala. I saw the man from the Astoria apartment, the one with the second-hand laptop and the empty espresso cups, the one I had believed in completely. That man had existed. I had not imagined him. He was not here anymore. I looked back at Ryan Ashford with the clear, level attention of someone who has grieved what needed to be grieved and is standing on the other side of it. He left the room. His attorney followed. The door closed. My father did not say anything. He put his hand on my shoulder for a moment, and then he removed it. And I was glad he understood that this was not a moment that needed language. 2 weeks after the boardroom meeting, I was at the estate with Sarah. The legal machinery was moving. The hostile takeover was proceeding through Apex. Ryan had been stripped of his CEO title at Vertex. The SEC referral was under active review. Everything that needed to be in motion was in motion. Sarah and I were in the conservatory, a glass-walled room off the back of the house where my father kept his orchids. We were drinking chamomile tea, and she was making me laugh about something small and entirely unrelated to any of this. It was the first time I had laughed in 3 weeks. Then Margaret called. She said, "Ellie, Ryan's defense team filed a motion in the Southern District this morning. His attorneys obtained financial due diligence documents from 3 years ago. Documents from Hartwell Capital's internal review of Vertex Analytics prior to the Series B closing. His defense is arguing that your father's analysts identified problems with the algorithm during that review and continued to invest anyway. He is claiming your family had prior knowledge of the fraudulent data and participated by proceeding with the funding." I said, "He is trying to implicate my father in the fraud," she said, "and by extension you. He is claiming the hostile takeover constitutes witness tampering and that you orchestrated it to conceal Hartwell Capital's own liability in the securities fraud." Sarah was watching my face from across the conservatory. I closed my eyes, held them closed for several seconds. Then I opened them. I said, "Margaret, those due diligence documents, does Ryan know what is actually in them?" She said his team subpoenaed them. They are reading them now. Then they are about to make a very expensive mistake. Those documents do not say what he thinks they say. My father's analyst did flag a discrepancy during the Series B review, but Ryan's team responded with an amended data package from Vertex's own internal audit division, certifying that the issue had been identified and resolved. My father's team accepted that certification in good faith, in writing, with Ryan's signature on the resolution document. We were not negligent, Margaret. We were lied to, in a signed legal document. By Ryan, she said, "Ellie, if that paper trail is as clean as you are describing." I said it is, because I spent 3 days last week going through my father's archives. I have the original flag, the amended response signed by Ryan, and the sign-off from Vertex's internal audit team confirming the issue was closed. Ryan just handed us proof that he's committed fraud before Hartwell Capital even knew what he was doing. I sent it to Diana Walsh at the U.S. Attorney's office this morning, 6 a.m. I had a feeling Ryan's team was moving in this direction. A long silence on the line. She said, "Ellie, I need to call Diana Walsh right now." I said, "I know. She is expecting to hear from you." Sarah put her tea down very carefully. She said, "You sent it at 6 in the morning." I said, "I could not sleep." She looked at me for a moment. She said, "You knew." I said, "I suspected. I hoped I was wrong." That night, from a rental house in Westport, Connecticut, Ryan Ashford accessed Vertex's server backend using a developer credential he had not disclosed during the hostile takeover process. Diana Walsh's office had been monitoring his network activity for 11 days. Bradley Webb had provided the U.S. Attorney's office with the access logs showing the undisclosed credential 3 days prior. Ryan's plan was to download the proprietary data of 43 Fortune 500 client companies, healthcare records, financial models, private consumer profiles, and send a ransom demand, $50 million in a cryptocurrency wallet, or the entire database would be released publicly. He believed it would give him leverage to negotiate his way out of the federal proceedings and destroy Hartwell Capital's reputation in the process. He did not know that 6 federal agents were already parked outside. At 2:14 in the morning, the arrest was executed, quietly, efficiently, the way federal cases actually work. Not cinematic, not dramatic, just thorough. The charges filed in the Southern District of New York: wire fraud, securities fraud, attempted extortion, and unauthorized access to protected computer systems. He had spent 7 years building an empire on a foundation of someone else's money and fabricated data, and a very specific kind of arrogance that mistake itself for genius. And when the foundation cracked, he had reached for the detonator. He had not known, until the door came down, that the detonator was already in someone else's hand. I found out about the arrest at 7 in the morning when Diana Walsh called. I was sitting in the estate kitchen with a cup of coffee and Fletcher at my feet. She said, "It is done." I said. All right, she said. Are you okay? I thought about the question for a moment. I thought about the Nordstrom bag upstairs in my childhood bedroom closet, the tiny ivory booties in their tissue paper, the note card that said coming May 14th. I thought about the cab ride through the October rain 7 weeks ago. I thought about Sarah's arm around my shoulders in the West Village apartment. I thought about my father opening the front door before my car had stopped. I said, I think I am going to be. 8 months is a long time to wait for something that is already decided. The federal case against Ryan Ashford proceeded with the methodical momentum of the Southern District of New York, which has seen every variety of financial crime that exists and handles each one with the same focused, unhurried efficiency. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The evidence was, as Diana Walsh had told me it would be, overwhelming. Ryan's defense team attempted 4 different strategies. The first 3 failed within days. The fourth, the attempt to implicate Hartwell Capital in prior knowledge of the algorithmic fraud, collapsed on its own weight the moment the amended data package signed by Ryan himself was entered into evidence. The document he had used to quiet my father's analysts 3 years ago became, in the courtroom, the clearest single proof that he had known about the fraud and actively worked to conceal it from his investors. The trap he had reached for became the one that held him. I attended the sentencing on a Thursday morning in early spring. The United States District Court for the Southern District of New York is a room of dark oak and pale marble. The air has the specific, weighty quiet of federal justice, the kind of silence that is not empty but held, the way a room holds its breath before something important. Ryan sat at the defense table. The Tom Ford suits were a memory. He was gaunt in the particular way that 8 months of federal proceedings makes visible. The thinning that happens when a man spends that long confronting who he actually is. He did not look up when the doors at the back of the courtroom opened. I was in the back row. To my left was Sarah, who had driven in from the West Village at 7 in the morning and brought 2 coffees and said almost nothing since she arrived, which was exactly right. To my right was a car seat. In the car seat, in a pale blue knit blanket, was a sleeping infant, a boy born 6 weeks earlier, at Greenwich Hospital. On a Tuesday morning in February, when the light through the window was the specific thin white of late winter, and the trees outside were still completely bare. His name was James Henry Hartwell. I had not given him his father's last name. He had a middle name that had belonged to my grandfather, the one who used to say the oak trees on the driveway were older than the state. Judge Patricia Cale entered at 9:15. She was in her early 60s and had presided over this courtroom for 17 years. She read from the sentencing brief without theatrical flourish. She was complete, and she was methodical, and she did not perform anything. She said, Mr. Ashford, the pattern of conduct documented in this case represents a sustained, deliberate, and sophisticated effort to deceive investors, manipulate markets, and ultimately leverage the private data of millions of individuals as a personal financial instrument. This court finds no mitigating factor sufficient to offset the scale of that conduct. The sentence of this court is 22 years, federal prison, with no provision for early release. The gavel fell. As the federal marshals began leading Ryan toward the side door, he turned to look at the gallery, the way people do at the end of things, searching for something they cannot name. His eyes found me in the back row. They moved to the car seat. He stopped. The marshal beside him paused. The room became very still. Ryan looked at me, then at James, then at me again. His face held something I had not seen there in a very long time. Something underneath the arrogance and the calculation and the specific mask that money puts on certain men. Something that might, if he had made different choices at every critical juncture of the past 7 years, have been his best quality. He looked at his son for a long time. I held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Not with hatred, not with triumph, with the particular steadiness of someone who has grieved what needed to be grieved and reached the far side of it. Then I looked down at James. I adjusted the edge of his blanket where it had shifted slightly. He did not wake up. I did not look back at Ryan. The marshal touched his arm gently. Ryan walked through the side door. It closed behind him. The courtroom began to empty. Sarah put her hand over mine on the armrest. She did not say anything. Neither did I. I want to be honest about what I felt in that room, because people ask, and they expect the answer to be relief or justice or vindication. And those words are not wrong exactly, but they are not quite right either. What I felt was grief, not for Ryan as he stood there, for the man he was when I first knew him. In the Astoria apartment with the secondhand laptop and the empty espresso cups and the enormous ambition that had not yet become something else. That man had existed. I had not imagined him. The years we spent together were real years, with real moments inside them. And the grief of losing someone who was genuinely real, even when what came after was false. That grief is also real. Grief is not a sign that you made the wrong choice. It is the honest response to actual loss. Letting yourself feel it, without interpreting it as weakness, without rushing to get past it, is one of the bravest things I know how to do. Sarah and I walked out of the courthouse into a gray March morning. She carried the car seat. I carried the bag. We walked to the parking garage without speaking, and then she buckled James into the back seat of her car and got in the driver's side, and I got in beside James, and I watched him sleep the whole way back to Greenwich. 4 months after the sentencing, on a morning in early July, when the light through the tall windows was the particular clear gold of a New York summer, I was at my desk in a converted loft space in Dumbo, Brooklyn. The loft had high ceilings and wide plank wood floors and a view of the Manhattan Bridge from the east-facing windows. There were 6 desks occupied by people who appeared to be working with great focus and a reasonable amount of caffeine. One of them was Sarah, who had left her event planning firm 3 months earlier to become the operations director of what we were building. She was visible through the glass wall of the small conference room, gesturing animatedly to someone on a video call. This was not the Hartwell estate. This was not a corner office at Hartwell Capital, which my father had offered me the week after the sentencing with the quiet, careful hope of a man who has learned to offer without pushing. I had declined, gently but completely. What I was building instead, using the stripped and rebuilt server infrastructure from Vertex Analytics, cleaned of Ryan's fraudulent code by a team of engineers who had spent 4 months on nothing else, was an open-source data platform for nonprofit organizations, food banks, public health networks, rural school districts, organizations that handle critical information and cannot afford enterprise solutions. The platform was designed to be free at the point of use and sustainable through a network of institutional partners. It was my idea, not my father's, not Margaret's, not Sarah's. A bassinet sat beside my desk. James was asleep in it, his face turned slightly to one side, one small fist pressed against his cheek. He had Ryan's jaw and my grandmother's eyes, which I found completely unfair and also perfect. He was 4 months old and had already learned to look at the window when he was interested in something, which meant he and I spent a significant portion of each morning looking at the same patch of sky. My father came to Dumbo twice a week. He would arrive with coffee and no agenda, sit in the chair across from my desk, and ask questions about the platform with genuine curiosity. Not the performance of curiosity, the real thing. He was learning, at 67, to be interested in what his daughter was building rather than what he could add to it. I had not asked him to do this. He had figured it out himself. That matters. People who love you figuring out what you actually need, without being told, is rarer than it should be, and more valuable than almost anything I can name. On the desk behind me was a shelf with a few books and a small collection of things that meant something. A photograph of my grandmother at a table in the greenhouse at Hartwell Farm, laughing at something off camera. A postcard from Sarah from a trip she took to Portugal the previous fall. Before all of this, with a message on the back that said, "You are the best person I know." Full stop. A sticky note in Dr. Hayes' handwriting, left after a session we had at my kitchen table 6 weeks ago. Progress, not perfection. And on the far end of the shelf, a Nordstrom bag, small, white, still holding a pair of tiny ivory knit baby booties in white tissue paper and a handwritten notacard that said coming May 14th. I kept it not as a relic of the worst night of my life. I kept it as evidence that even in that moment, standing in a cold penthouse kitchen with rain on the windows and the weight of a choice I had not yet made, I was already, without knowing it, moving towards something new. James made a small sound in the bassinet. Not a cry, just the commentary of someone reassessing their position. I reached over and put my hand lightly on his back, and he settled immediately, the way babies do when they feel the specific reassurance of a presence they already know completely. I thought about all the things I would tell him someday. Not the version of the story that is simple. Not the one where the hero is obvious from the first scene and the villain never had a good quality. The real version. The one where a young man with genuine talent let the wrong things matter more than the right ones. The one where a young woman hid something essential about herself out of a fear she mistook for wisdom. The one where a father watched from a careful distance when he should have picked up the phone. The one where 2 women who had been positioned as enemies chose, in a moment of crisis, to be something else. James would know all of it. He would know what his family has and exactly how it was built and exactly what it can and cannot purchase. He would know that money is a tool and not an identity. He would know that the people who love you for what you come from are a different category of people entirely from the ones who love you for who you are. He would know that his mother made choices, her own choices, that she chose honesty, eventually, imperfectly, genuinely, over comfort, that she chose to sit at the head of the table when it mattered, that she chose to receive help from an unexpected source because the substance was more important than her feelings about the source, that she chose to grieve what needed grieving and keep moving. That, to me, is the inheritance that matters. I want to leave you with 5 things, not as therapeutic frameworks, not as legal advice, just as what I actually learned from living through this. 1. The quiet support you give someone is never invisible. It may go uncredited for years. It may be weaponized against you when the relationship breaks down. But it is real. It is the foundation of something. The fact that someone chose not to see it says everything about them and nothing about its worth. 2. The first 48 hours after a betrayal are critical. Do not react publicly. Get legal counsel before you take any action. Document everything you have legitimate access to. Your stillness in those hours is not passivity. It is strategy. 3. The person you most want to blame is rarely the most powerful actor in the room. Look at the whole picture before you decide where to aim your energy. The person with the most to lose is usually the one making the most noise. 4. Help comes from unexpected places. The ability to receive it, even when it is complicated, even when it costs you something emotionally, is not weakness. It is a form of courage that does not get enough credit. 5. Your moment of clarity will probably not feel like power. It will probably feel like the first real breath you have taken in years. It will be quiet. It will come at an inconvenient time. It will not look the way you expected. Trust it anyway. That feeling is the beginning of something true. I looked out the window at the July light on the Manhattan Bridge. James sighed in his sleep. Fletcher, who had moved from the estate to my apartment 3 months ago because my father decided he and I needed each other more than he and my father did, lifted his head from the floor beside the desk, assessed the situation, and put his head back down. Sarah came out of the conference room, laughing at something the person on the call had said. The day continued, which is, when you think about it, exactly what days are supposed to do. If this story resonated with you, if you have felt unseen in a relationship, or underestimated, or quietly erased, I would genuinely love to hear from you in the comments. Not because shared pain is the point, because knowing you are not alone in something actually helps. It helped me. Subscribe if you are new here. There are more stories where this one came from. Hit the notification bell so you do not miss the next one. And take care of yourselves. I mean that.